Well, starting with your personal life story, I guess. You went to America for your doctoral studies,
Uh-huh.
and I was wondering around this time, especially going back to Taiwan as like someone who studied in the U.S., were there any events that happened that really left an impact on you?
That's a long story.
Oh.
Because for those of us educated in Taiwan, the Taiwanese writer Chen Yingzhen calls we don't have the left eye cut off. So that's how we grew up. But in the US, fortunate or unfortunate, all my, how should I say, classmates, senior ones, these were all Marxists.
Mm-hmm.
And my own supervisor is a Marxist. So you suddenly realize your education was completely, I don't want to say 100% false, but it's half of the story gets completely untold. So that's how things get started, especially influenced by the senior PhD students. They would tell you, go to read this and that. Around that time, in the US academic context, there are several trends. One is this thing called critical theory. The other is called cultural study. So these are all critical theory mainly mediating through English department and comparative literature.
Mm-hmm.
And cultural study at that time basically means the Birmingham School, which is London-based. And I pointed to you these decapitations. These were, to put it simply, sort of minor institution, easier to implement new programs. And Stu Hall put it straight. He said cultural study is not an academic discipline. It is a space where we can get critical intellectual work done. So we met him in the US, and then I was actually the editor. This still exists. At that time, it was a kind of student journal called Journal of Communication Inquiry. So we did a special issue on him when he was visiting. That was the beginning. And the notion of the third world in some way begins with the study in the US, because he met students from Africa, from Latin America, and different places. And when I finished all my courseworks, then I went to Berkeley. And Berkeley itself is already, how should I say? I don't want to say radical. Right? At that time, going through 1960 student movement, Berkeley was on the lead. And there was a group of students coming out of Taiwan. And so we formed a club. In a way, it's operating something like this. It's called a food co-op. So we because you're a student, you don't have time. So we go to supermarket and all that together to buy food and cook. Like, for instance, you cook a whole bunch of chicken. Then so we share on the dinner table to exchange food.
Mm-hmm.
So that group was 50%. One of the movement, which I don't know whether your generation would know, 保钓运动, is protecting. In English they call Fishing Pole Island. In Japanese they call Senaku Island or something. So this is an island between Okinawa, Taiwan, and Korea, and so on, right? So different places claim it's their own land.
Wait, it started back then?
It started in the 1970s.
Oh.
Yeah, but mainly mediating through science engineering students. This is basically nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
So against Japanese. So there are Hong Kong students involved and so on. So, but there were several. By this time, you call most of them already passed away, kind of pioneering figure. These were Taiwan educated, used to be liberal, but they were influenced by, for instance, Cultural Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So they went to, different library and found out this is the motherland. So that generation of people sort of coming earlier than the Fishing Port Island movement. But so they formed different bases, one in New York, one in Chicago, one in LA. And so student group somehow mediating through actually this figure right around. Xia Zhujiu, he was in architecture, urban planning. Now he finished with National Taiwan University and became chair professor with Nanjing University, or you call Tung right? Northeastern, which is famous for architecture and design and so on. So because he's older than us, so through his introduction, so these points get linked. So some of us, so this LA group, after we went back, to Taiwan, they called La Group because abbreviated is LA. So some of them went there. Chicago was a base for summer gathering, like a summer camp.
Mm-hmm.
And LA group, they go there to read Marx's Capital. So most of these people went back there earlier than I did. I taught 1 year in CUNY, Queens College. They went back earlier, become some kind of underground movement activists in labor, women's movement, environmental, and so on. So that group was already there. I did all my dissertation on, at that time, which is a trend on postmodern theory. And CUNY had this job opening, want somebody to do postmodern theory. That's how I got the job. But then because most of my friends went back, so I finished just 1 term. I taught 1 term, and I went back, took leave. They kept the job for 2 years. So that's how I made this transition, moving back home. But because people are already there, it's also through like the people I just mentioned, we talk about this Taiwan Radical Quarterly, which is started right after or even before the lifting of martial law. Mm-hmm. So that journal still exists. Around the end of 1980s, after the lifting of martial law become the most turbulent era. So when we went back there, we were mostly actually on the street to organize, demonstration. So we grew up with that generation of student movement leaders. Some of them by now occupy important position with the DPP, and some became county mayor. And this famous person, the KMT chairperson, right? This woman, she was also part of the student movement. And the student movement cut into 2 parts. One is basically composed of students from National Taiwan University and the rest. And these they call the Democratic Student Movement Alliance. So National Taiwan University are basically composed of individuals for individual interests. These are the people now become politicians. Yeah.
And were you also with this group of like individuals?
Yeah. So these are, Taiwan's oppositional DPP basically composed of medical doctor, lawyer, and all these. And there's no, how did I say, no soil for left-wing politics. They formed this Labor Party, collapsed. Then they formed Workers' Party, now still exists. But in terms of electoral politics, has never really worked. Partly because of here. Because people look across the strait, looking at the politics here. So that's where the so-called Taiwan independence or unification politics intertwined with ethnic politics since 1980 somewhere. When we went back there, I still remember we spent teaching, of course, but mainly writing for newspaper columns. So that's the question you asked. That's one way to go home, because you're talking to the public. So that's one way. Then different group, very, very different group. One magazine was very hip at the moment called Our Margin, 岛屿边缘. So these are very hip magazines, so influence the entire generation, kind of younger generations, student, or how do you say, 文青? Right? These are literary young people, right? I guess that's how things basically started. And then moving on from mid-80 until present day. Yeah, but for my own experience, because I mentioned we met the students in the US, University of Iowa, basically, all these several students. So when I went back there, I organized some of us getting together. We did several things. One is we have a monthly forum called the Cultural Criticism Forum. So any topic. So that around that time, actually thinking back, this is what do you say, 百花齐放, thousands of flowers blooming or something, right? And so all different kinds of saw, from US, from Europe, from any other places, including elements of Taoism, small elements with them. So we started this conference, basically composed of these sort of older networks. Some of the people you met in the US. And it's called a trajectory conference, basically trying to track kind of different intellectual work. For instance, in contemporary China, modern contemporary China, Lu Xun has to be one, and so on. So different locations have different resources. So we're trying to sort out in different neighborhoods, because everyone was facing basically the US and Western Europe. And we have this metaphor. If you're in Korea, we want to open your refrigerator to see what you have, because different places have resources. So is it possible to learn from each other's resources? That's how then we started the journal officially on the year 2000, called the Interasia Cultural Study, with a subtitle called The Movements. Because at that moment, most of the editorial people involved in different kinds of movements. So we position ourselves as a part of the larger, we position ourselves as an intellectual movement. So we publish anything, including novels and so on. So by now, 20 some years, almost close to 30 years. So build a network, not only in the region. So the turning point is actually 2015. The journal formed in 2000, then we developed not association, a society to run biannual conference. Then we built the Interasia School.
Mm-hmm.
So not only biannual conference, but also summer school. And our conference is different from others. We have a pre-conference for graduate students. So the idea is for younger generation, whatever you call it, scholar or intellectual, can meet early on in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how over the past 20-some years build up a network. Last year in Bangkok, there were about over 800 people attended. This is all voluntary, like students pay $10 to register. And the largest one was in Tokyo, around 2012 or something. Over 1,000 people appeared. So the idea is very simple. Can we use each other as a reference point? That's the story I try to tell you. You go to other places, then you look back, you found the difference, then you begin to explain.
Mm-hmm.
But the way of explanation is not using theoretical term, but local history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there was this once pick up is I don't want to say slogan, but it's like the more you go to Seoul, the more you understand Taipei. Yeah. So I think it's probably similar experience. The more you go to Boston, you probably understand Nanjing or anywhere differently.
Mm. Totally.
So basically using that, we call interreferencing, not comparison, because comparison is impossible. Because there is no basic point for comparison. But you can look at each other, or how dirty you are, and you can find that actually mutually shared. So that's how we try to understand what the hell is the third world. Basically get defined as those who have been colonized before.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem situation in mainland China because a lot of people think the Central Plateau were never colonized. But if you look at it as a whole, Nanjing was never a concession, right? 租界地, Nanjing wasn't.
I don't think so.
Right, but Shanghai, Tianjin, and all that, 租界地 is actually basically just colony.
Mm-hmm.
The only difference is there's a leasing, so 99 years or something. So the first colony in Northeast Asia is basically Hong Kong, and then Okinawa, then Taiwan, then Korean Peninsula. So because the post-war era, U.S. basically had taken over the Japanese empires or Japanese colony, Korea, Taiwan, and so on. Right? So surprisingly, it's not only in these places. U.S. academia became extremely influential in mainland China, become if not the only point of dialogue.
Mm. So
we had this conference, a similar situation. Yeah. So the point of dialogue defined the limit, because once you're engaged in dialogue with them, they're part of you.
Mm.
So our method is how do you use other places to dilute, and more resources coming in. And I think in Japanese there is one term called Americanism, meaning it is basically from 1960s U.S. student movement and counterculture. But later on we found out it's not a misunderstanding, but a very partial. Cultural revolution was there, actually all kinds of student movement going on in different parts of the world, in Indonesia, in different places. Yeah, so the similar situation goes on in different places. So a lot of these critical intellectuals somehow were coming out of the student movement activism. And a lot of our friends involved in the journal become stakeholders and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Should I stop here for a moment?
Sure.
Yeah.
My next question is also related to your experience going abroad and back.
Mm-hmm.
So I find this very common among, I guess, third world intellectuals, like you or like Kibla Tahimik or like a picture Ponwir Stakul. They all went abroad and then came back to their own soil, I guess. So how do you deal with these two different intellectual traditions or environments, and how do you like relate with these two traditions?
These are very good questions. But the dominant trend is actually they stay on. Especially for science and engineering students, right? They stay on. And the same thing with contemporary mainland Chinese students studying in the US, they stay on. They become China specialists because of the rise of China. But for a lot of us, going home is a kind of commitment. Trying to, because your social relations there, and something can be done there, not in the US. And this is probably after left the US for 15, 20 years, then you found out you don't want to go back anymore because you went back there, nothing is new. The new things are all mediating through foreigners from India, from Latin America. I'm talking about basically humanities, social sciences. Not to engineering basically dominated by a lot of these Asians, right? Indians and so on. So going home for this group of people is actually, especially for instance like the Inter-Asia Cultural Study Network, and people, we could have stayed, like myself, I could have stayed in New York, but I don't want to say you choose not to, but it's almost like because your friend all went back there and you want to do something different rather than continue the same kind of thing. But you raised the important question, how do you negotiate with whatever you want to call it, local or indigenous and so on. So one example would be like in Shanghai University Cultural Study Department. I keep telling them the roots is actually Luxun. Because the person started the program, Wang Xiaoming was a Luxun scholar. And the reason why he went there was because very simple, global ranking. Modern used to be the case. Modern Chinese literature is actually the department is the site for thought. Not only for literary study, but once professionalized. And cultural study provides a space where intellectual thought or intellectual critical work can be done. So that's why all these terms gets picked up. And so because of that, you try to link with the existing resources. So then, as I said, actually those early generation, they have been thinking about all these issues before. Right? And not only in Japan, in different places, they're conscious of, we cannot keep, what is in the Chinese term, 叫什么？全盘西化要怎么讲？ completely westernization, right? But that's still going on, unconsciously or consciously. Right? But then what about your own? And actually, in a lot of places, Western European theory became the explanation, and local history become footnotes. There is no historical explanation, which is still going on here. So unless we go back to history, but going back to one example is going back to literature. Because literature is history. If it writes about contemporary life. So through Chen Yingzhen we found out how life in Taiwan, but not only. Right? And these such writers exist everywhere. In Korea, the one famous writer, Hwang Xi, in Indonesia is a Pramudia. These are all locally situated writers. They're trying to come to terms with their own problems. Such tradition actually exists in East Asia, in where? Newspaper, supplement, 副刊. Not only literary, but cultural criticism, and still there's an opinion section. How do you look at this issue? Like, what the hell Donald Trump is doing and so on. You know? So those things have been there for at least 1 century, if not more. So we kind of position ourselves, the journal is like the East Asian critical intellectual. So the emphasis is actually critical thought. So the research has to be in relation to that. So thought is completely different from theory. Thought is emotionally charged and locally, historically situated. And only slowly, so that's one strategy, one can develop is, for instance, you go to Singapore, you try to collect books locally produced, rather than these people writing in the US. All these books exist everywhere. So those become resources or sort of method. You can read directly what happened in these places and so on. So that's what I early on tried to explain to you. When you go somewhere, read their history to see what's going on. It's an infinite, impossible task to finish, but those are the entry point to connect with different local intellectual, if not longer, at least modern ones. But like we're familiar with, like Chinese has Taoism, not only they say Buddhism is from India and so on, but there's also a huge population of Muslim, all these. So these are potentially are all our resources. It's like the film your mother produced. These are all local stories. They document. We call this is a very difficult term. 精神状况, how would you translate? Psychic, spiritual, or something, but there's no equivalent term. So basically, the kind of 精神, but because these are the engine to move you forward. You have some sort of anxiety. I don't know what's going on. So trying to come to terms with those problems. So that become the conditions for knowledge.
You mentioned some very important terms, and I wanted to focus on them, I guess one by one. But let's start with maybe the most central one or fundamental one. When you talk about third world, what do you mean? And especially now that the term global south is gaining prevalence, are there distinctions between these two terms? And do you consciously make a choice to use one of them over another?
It's a very simple answer. We know what is third world. We don't know what is global south. Because third world, the notion of third world has everything to do with 1955 Bandung Conference.
Hmm.
Right. Zhou Enlai was there, but Zhou Enlai, this is only example. Zhou Enlai was invited by Nairu, and others. And that's where China was brought back to the international stage. So that concrete history is there. But the notion of global south is a very ambiguous one. What is south to south? That's okay. I mean, Latin American in collaboration with the Southern Sahara, Africa. I think those things need to be done. But from our own location, it's not only a geographical term. So the simple question is China in the north or south? But why do you position in North Korea? And if you're talking about X/socialism, Eastern Europe is in the north. So global south is not a proper, it's not a proper term to describe. Third world has historical, I'm not suggesting third world is the most adequate term. But unless other terms emerge, third world is still a better choice than global south. And in the Chinese context, very clear, you call Yafela. Right? So those terms have been embedded in even popular life. Everyone knows what is Yafela. Right? And China also went through this period, even during the difficult moments, supporting different places. It's not partly for internationalism, partly for what Communist International, and so on. So in that sense, according to some of these specialists, why global south get picked up in China because of the invitation from Africa. So after the think tank, they decided, okay, we'll take out that term. But actually recently, I heard this term is dropped because it's just not adequate. And when I look around, almost all the doors, right, main gate are open. You go to Europe, it's not going to be the case. They will be locked. And you go to Taipei and so on, we all have these 铁皮屋. Right. So, in other words, economic development cannot displace history. So history never finished. And especially colonialism never finished. It's in our heart or in our thought. So those fragments you cannot erase. But it can be multiplied, by others. That's the term I use, dilute. So other sources can come in. But before that's done, we're still at that difficult stage. Because colonialism has operated for 4th century. It probably is going to be as long as at least 2 centuries, if not longer, to, I don't want to say displace, but at least to have equal say or even, have others. The problem is how do we come up with alternative analytical framework and so on, but also grounded in history. That's not what European theories attempted to do. It's purely abstraction. Yeah. So that's why we say our knowledge is still very limited. So we have to be very humble with the knowledge we developed until this point.
Could you tell me more about the connection between the Third World and colonialism?
These are inseparable terms. Because Third World means those places which have been colonized. But then you have to make a really fine distinction between imperialism and colonialism. Because colonialism is by definition imperialism, not vice versa. So some places For instance, U.S. never colonized, let's say, where? India. Right? But it has tremendous influence. That's some people call the culture of imperialism. Right? So India encountered the second kind, but India developed their own system, like subaltern studies and so on, emerged from India. Especially speaking in this context about China, China is part of the third world. It has to be put forefront for understanding, rather than only these like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so on. So there's no empathy for these places. So some of the Chinese, whatever scholars, they say Hong Kong's dog, because they don't look at them. So partly I say straightforward. There's a problem with Chairman Mao's this term called semi-colony. But if you're Marxist or if you're Chinese, you look at it as a whole. So this is part of this whole. You cannot say, this party is not colonized, but this party is. You're sick. And it's all interconnected. That's the basic theory with Chinese medicine, right? So you have to adjust the entire body, especially, thought. If precisely because there is no such understanding, it becomes self-colonization. That's how they deploy, Euro-American theory to explain Chinese context.
And then there's the term inter-Asia, which is also connected with your publication and stuff. Could you also tell me about what does this mean and who came up with it, and I guess what have you guys done with it?
Now, inter-Asia is very simple term because I did some research. There's about 16 world region. In other words, South Asia historically were organic. I don't want to say unity. Trade, basically through trade route. Everywhere have very diversified language. And Northeast Asia has something shared in common historically. So inter means these different regions have its own roughly existing historical relation or network. So inter means we try to learn from South Asia or West Asia and so on. But once again, we have to be very cautious that all these terms, Asia, these are global imperial mapping, right, in the world history. And so, out of convenience, you don't have any other better term. Like what I suggest to you, like Christianity and Catholic, this will basically grow out of Palestine, which is West Asia. But gets completely, I don't want to say misunderstood, but transplanted. They try to connect with, different places in Europe, as if it grew out of there, but it's actually not. But before we use it, I think the important recognition is actually several things. There was a net already, when we started, it was already a kind of inter-America network. Because there are different kinds of American continent, right? Even north is the Canada and US. And Latin America also cut into different middle, South, some people call South America. And there's also different places, like the Caribbean and so on. And some people say, why don't you use intra? Simply because we don't know each other. If you know each other, you can say intra, but we don't know. So inter gesture a meaning that we need to learn from different regions. Why? That's what I tried to suggest it, right? I mean, one of the baggage of colonialism is the problem of nation state. But region is a different thing. But the difficult question, can we possibly use region to displace nation state? Which is very difficult, because nationalism has been cultivated for at least 1.5 century in the third world. But at least if you imagine as a region, we have historical relation there. So you cannot look at China in isolated instance. You have to be placed, at least, if not, at least in Northeast Asia. But in China instance, it's much more complicated because the border is connected with South Asia and Southeast Asia, Yunnan and so on. So in that sense, it's connected with most part of Asia. Politically, Northeast Asia is the only region that doesn't have a super state. Southeast Asia has ASEAN. South Asia also has that. Only Northeast Asia has no. Super state means there is a. I give you the imagination of Africa. Africa has this thing called the Pan-Africanism. So they imagine African Union as a central state, and the rest as local state. But if you can, in other words, if you can have a mega state, a lot of these land controversy may be able to dealt with. And labor condition can be, for instance, if you have Northeast Asia, whatever you call community or union, we can say we should have an equal labor condition. Or education should be able to flow, and so on. And so that's how we try to maybe imagine, to use different terms, maybe generate different kind of imagination and possibilities. That's why inter-Asia.
You also mentioned the point of dialogue, like, for example, when an intellectual is writing, who's their imagined audience? Perhaps that's part of what that means, but also like, I guess, who are you talking to and who are you talking with?
It's a multi-layered. Because we like we talk to each other. Like scholars talk to each other, but that's only on the surface. Once you talk, there are people sitting there to listen. If you write, you don't know who are the audience. In that sense, multi-layered. So any dialogue or debate is not between two persons. Shared or adopted elements of it, how would they take it, you don't know, by the audience. Especially in terms of writing, or like you are doing YouTube, you don't know who the hell is watching them. But how do you know they're not influenced? So you can imagine, but you cannot put your finger on it, who are exactly the target audience. At least potential audience. They can sit there, but also they don't listen, so you don't know. But the point of dialogue is basically trying to learn the difference. It's like become mutual informant. Like if you're talking to me about, like Yingzhen, oh, here is the shopping mall and so on. From outside, we don't know. So this is in anthropology term called native informant. Right? Because you live here enough, you can only explain to outsider what the logic operating here. So that's part of the thing. What is the operating social logic on the ground in different places? So that once you talk to each other, it's like a migrant worker. Once they are somewhere, they have to learn how things operate. But that can only be learned from dialogue or observation.
Could you tell me more about your journal, Taiwan, a Radical Quarterly in Social Studies? Because you were deeply involved with it since its early days. And how does a journal become a frontier for intellectual thought? And I guess because of this political pressure from both sides, what is the survival strategy?
In the beginning, there was no survival strategy because it's not a disciplinary journal. Because people involved in the journal coming from all disciplines. So you cannot talk in disciplinary terms. So you have to use language. That's what we saw. It's an intellectual magazine. But somehow, especially in the early era, it's widely recognized by the academic institution. But because it carried the notion of social, once this global ranking and the ranking on the journal began, like sociology would say this is not sociology, and so on. So most of a lot of our friends, economists and sociologists and so on, they don't write for their own discipline. Because we have actually wider audience. People from different. The academic problem is once you're economist, only student in economics will read. But this journal is in that sense different. We never had problem with survival because there is no funding problem. But actually we won certain awards, so we hired a full-time editorial assistant to organize meetings and forum. And some of this material will be going into the journal itself. It's already three, 4 generations. But it will still go on. It's recognized by, well, let me put it this way. Those who are more established, they don't care. And those who, younger ones, they cannot find, space to publish it in their own discipline, they can publish it. Yeah. But it's not that we have referee system. It's not like you can just publish anything you want. Yeah. The first year publications is year 2000, already 26 years. And the forecast will continue to exist. People don't understand, what people don't understand is, this is one of very, very few international, even is operating in Mandarin Chinese. We have board people and contribution from different places. Because this thing is very, as I said, right, in art world or in different world, there's this thing called the influence study. But the influence cannot be studied. How do you study influence? It's like our conversation. How do you know you influence me or I influence you? So influence is a very difficult thing. But there's some indication. See, because a lot of these young contributors, they say, we grew up with this journal. Then but if you cut in deeper question, which part of it you learn from? They probably even themselves cannot tell. Probably certain episode, probably certain activity they attend. And we also have an annual conference for younger scholars and so on. And for graduate students, we have graduate student award for MA and PhD thesis. The same thing with the Inter-Asia journal. Yeah. So in a way, these two is a different language medium. And Inter-Asia is much wider base. Because editorial board is basically based in across Asia. Yeah. And we formed a consortium for over some 20-some institutions. The ideal is a student can move any point they want. An MOU was signed, but the problem is most of the students just they don't want to move. Yeah.
Who were your colleagues working on the Taiwan Radical Quarterly with you? And what was it like, I guess, working on the journal during those days where you were most involved?
Wow. You mean how? What exactly you're thinking of?
What was it like to work on the journal?
Because it is a cohesive group, we not only have monthly meeting, the important things afterwards is the meal and drinks. So conversation, also take off. And so you work as a group together. And somehow, and we participate in all the rallies. We have our own flag. So in a way that's one part of your identity you have. So we see as one block. And by now, and a lot of these become leading figures in their own field. Activities, conference, journals, and we even publish books. We publish, I don't know, by now 50, 60 books, readers, and so on, and translation. So, I keep telling the younger generation, say, don't isolate, don't get isolated. You have to work as a group. At least you have friends to share the anxiety and so on. Right? So that's basically that group. We actually debate and quarrel, but still can work together because it's long enough. Yeah. And so on. Now basically the middle generation have taken over. We develop policy, all these, because the younger generation have their different concern. And maybe they're in charge, the even more younger ones will be willing to contribute or something. Yeah. And so on. So that's basically, I don't want to say solidarity, but in English, I learned a thing like in Asia called the labor of love. You just work it for free. You're not taking any money from it, but you feel, we're doing something together or something meaningful. I'm not attacking those people called ivory tower. Like historians doing archival work, those are important things. But they play different roles. And worthy respect. But this the kind of intellectual work you trying to at least reaching larger audience and take up contemporary issues. And if you've been working with journal long enough, you understand journal is actually not working for the present, it's for the future. Because the future generation want to look at history. Each journal basically document that moment. And how do they analyze that situation? And from looking back, maybe completely wrong or not sufficient, but basically materials are there. What important things have been happening. Otherwise, with purely academic discipline, a lot of event is lost. Yeah. So the basis is actually very simple, history. But history is a very difficult notion. Anything has the household here has a history. Yeah. So it depends on the context how you understand that moment of history.
And then I want to ask you about the Bandung School.
Oh.
I'm not sure if I pronounced it right, but could you first, I guess, tell us about why you set up the school, I guess its mission, and what it looks like today?
It's a collective project. Actually, it started around, the idea emerged out of around 2015 during the Bandung 60s. And the idea of Bandung School is we already explained, right, relation with the third world. Well, is it possible to work together? It's not like that's one thing. It can be located anywhere. It's already located in Indonesia, in Taiwan, in different places. So those places, they have to, we call 接地气, I don't know the proper term, right? Touching the earth or something. You have to be locally grounded, put it that way. So Bandung School idea is, for instance, can we jointly doing publication?
Mm.
Right? There are important writers in Indonesia and so on. It's like if you want to select, this important Indonesian writer, Pramudias, very short volume like this, right? Like a pamphlet to introduce him. But such book do not exist.
Mm.
But with the age of AI, at least that's why we experimented with this project with the Inter-Asia School called West Heaven Project. That's India-China dialogue. We produced like 8 volumes.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing is publication. It's quite, everything is connected with thought.
Mm-hmm.
And curatorial work, artwork. We did actually call the Inter-Asia Biennial, which connected biennial together. These two studios, we're still talking about that. But is it possible to set up a foundation for, we just said, if you don't want to study, but if we can give you scholarship to study what you're interested, but you need to make a commitment to science, say, I will contribute by writing. So once you have the idea of the Bandung School, all different things can happen underneath. But the key is you need to have multi-layered network. Involves art, involves publication network, involves curatorial team. We even imagine if we build a foundation, some money need to buy stock. Because you have to be self-reliant rather than, so the funding still need to come from different places. Rather than like this one, the problem we learn from this is the sources is just one source. Once they killed it, they killed it. Another thing we learned is something like this. Keep imagining. One thing you cannot be done at this moment, maybe it can be done in the future. Even it can never be done, at least we collectively imagine something. That's already something meaningful. That's basically the idea for the Bandung School, because you can infinitely add on anything. The ones existing there, Asia, Africa Writers Association after the Bandung, and non-aligned movement, and so on. And we did actually one under that, the film exhibition across Indian film across 10 different cities. That's also possible. So art network and film network, and also now like I don't know whether there's a YouTube network, or organized for YouTube. We talked about it, and those who occupy, their stakeholder, whether it is possible to construct an alternative news agency working together with, I'm talking about state, but that's losing, we're losing control over there. But we have friends who are involved in there, but whether they can make things change, we don't know. So in other words, there's an infinite possibility to imagine, but the idea is how to change the mode of thought. Yeah, and to learn more about different places.
Bandung itself is this name of a place, and because of its association with the meeting, it has this effect of a statement, I guess. And so I guess which threads of that movement are you guys trying to revitalize? And
there is one funny thing called Bandung spirit. And then around that time, but it's actually, they're very, if you Google, you can find it in non-intervention. In other words, this is Zhuanlai, right? We cannot interfere with others' domestic affairs. There's all different kinds of principles. But one important thing is mutually exchange of culture. That seldom happens. Yeah. And so on. But by now it's possible, for instance, within the university structure, you sign an MOU, but a lot of people told me the same thing. MOU signed, but students just don't want to go. Resources are there, and so on. Material condition gets better and better, but somehow because the world, if not the universe, is changing too fast, and I don't want to say we don't know how to talk to the younger generation who only plays with the phone, but how do they, in a way, maybe those are not the people we can connect with. We can connect with those students. Another funny term they call the creative industry, right? Those people doing film, theater, or independent bookstores. And these are the people who have the energy and also they have this drive to move rather than simply doing nothing. Maybe we should connect with that sector of people. So we can infinitely imagine, but the key is you need to have organizers around and keep pushing it. And as I said, with the assumption maybe completely fail, but that's okay. Otherwise, what are you going to do?
How can young people really walk out of their nation gate and really see the world?
You should tell me.
Maybe I haven't done that as much as you have.
No, we're no longer young, but we have the drive to know new things, new places. And maybe because of YouTube. And some of the young people sitting there, they think they know what's going on in different places. But actually, no. The idea is, for instance, if we go to Nanjing, we need to eat Nanjing food. That's how you physically and psychically feel. What is that? Those things you can look at the picture of the YouTube, but you cannot taste it. But how do you ask them to move? Unless you develop some sort of strategy of seduction. Right? And those are, because our generation is already, we are not AI generation. In a way, we are 活化石.
Living fossil.
Yes, exactly, living fossil. In other words, maybe people like us no longer exist. But we exist, you cannot say we don't have the right to try to do something. And maybe not optimistically, but at least otherwise in your life, what else you can do? Yeah, that's the kind of mindset.
You've done cross-regional work across Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
A little.
Are you willing to tell us about one experience where you maybe traveled to or interacted with a specific country?
For instance, one thing, if you go to Africa, you learn one thing. I forgot in Uganda or somewhere, you see all these boys lined up. They try to make a living by shining shoes. But then you have to ask yourself, why everyone has to have one job? Can two of us share one job? In Taiwan, we have this, I met this in southern Taiwan. These are couple. And so sometime I go there, they sell these little crafts like this. So one day I went there and say, where's your partner? And she said, he's on holiday. In other words, each of them work 15 to 16 a month. And you, the rest of the time, you can do anything you want. You can write anything, you can read, and so on. So in other words, this is the era we should forget about one person need to have a job. And actually, if two person work, if you're academic, two person have one job, probably more productive.
Mm-hmm.
That's the example what you learn, if you go to these places. Another example I learned from going to like Korea, they would say the most important relation is actually which senior high school you graduate from. At least I think that I'm trying to also suggest people, if you like drinking, go anywhere with the local. In Okinawa, there's a thing called aomori, which is potato based. In the summertime, you can put ice. In wintertime, you can put hot water. That's how you learn how local people live. And in that sense, you look back. They say sake is very expensive. So I go everywhere. You can eat a noodle with 8 RMB. And so it's always, if you do this, especially around certain things, so-called conventional market and festivals and so on, you will say local life still there, rather than saying it's all large shopping malls. It's just not correct.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things coexist. So in that sense, tradition is part of the modern, rather than traditional is traditional, modern is modern. Yeah, they coexist. Yeah. So this is why you want to be at least as much as possible. Anywhere you can get a chance to go, just go. So for us, like doing academic work, we cultivate a habit. Either we go there earlier or we left later in order to know the local life,
Mm-hmm.
which will be completely different from what you imagine. That's how and because the real knowledge is based upon real life, rather than simply, academic writing.
What kind of difficulties do you face when doing this kind of cross
Of
regional?
course, one of the difficulty everyone encounters is language. If you don't know the local language, you don't completely understand what the hell is going on.
Mm-hmm.
Language is one thing, but a lot of things, unless you have friends with you, you don't know. You just look at it strange. You don't know how to explain. So all kinds of difficulty. But one thing we learned is there are lot of unresolved problem you cannot resolve. Keep that in mind. Maybe one day you will be able to find the answer,
Mm-hmm.
rather than simply throw it away. But actually, you won't be able to. Those questions will naturally linger around. Yeah. So all kinds of problems.